I'm with having a chat with Craig Alexander, who everyone seems to know as Crowie. It's a boring old question, but I'll start with it. Why is the nickname that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I've had it 20 years. Dates back to the late 90s. I was at an Australian team training camp down in Thredbo in the mountains, and we had a rare afternoon off from training. We were sitting around watching the Surf Ironman, which was on TV. Back then, I think it was the Uncle Toby's or the Nutrigrain series, and there was an athlete, Jonathan Crowe, who was well known. He'd won the Coolangatta Gold, and a few of the other boys thought that I looked like him, so I became known as Crowie from then on, and it stuck. So,
okay, you've probably told that story 1,000 times.
A few times.
I don't know, I think what I'm curious about is just talking to someone from outside the sport who does a lot of our sport. You're not tempted to head on back to Kona, are you?
Well, I'll always head back, but it'll be as a spectator.
Yeah.
There's an old saying in sport, Father Time's undefeated, and I mean, if I had my way, I'd go back to race every year, but it's just not realistic. I think in an endurance event, you can flourish into your 40s. There's no doubt. I mean, I set the record there as a 38-year-old, and I think Dave Scott, the other famous American, finished second in 94 as a 40-year-old, retired for the second time, came back 5 years later as a 45-year-old and finished fifth. So I don't think it's so much age, it's more the things that age brings. At my age, I have 3 young children, I have other opportunities that I would like to pursue, and I've devoted 20 great years to the sport of triathlon to better myself as an athlete, and I think seven or 8 years in Kona. So, and I'm very proud of what I achieved there. And I mean, the athlete and the competitor in you always wants to go back. Even the last few years watching there, I've had itchy feet, but it's a 12-month of the year proposition, that one. It's the kind of event that requires your complete attention, your entire focus. I used to plan the 12 months up to the race in Hawaii the night of finishing it that year. It was all consuming for me, and that's what I loved about it. That wasn't daunting for me. I loved that aspect of it. But I'm just at a different stage of life. My children were a lot younger, or not even born when I was racing there, and I know what it takes to prepare to be competitive there, and I just don't have the time, I think. I mean, the desire is still there. I still love the sport of triathlon. I love training very hard. I love the challenge of pushing myself, but to be realistic and honest, I can never see myself racing in Hawaii again. I just think it's too much of an all-consuming focus, and I don't have the time anymore.
Do you get out with your young ones or not? Do you go riding, swimming, running? What do they prefer?
Well, they've grown up around endurance sports, so yeah, the 2 eldest, well, actually all 3 of them, they're 11, 7 and 3. They've grown up around the sport. The 2 eldest have done the kids triathlons, very keen bike riders. My oldest daughter is an amazing runner. She's just been to nationals for cross country and athletics, so she finished 5th in her age group in the 800 metres and 6th in Australia in cross country for her age group. So we actually do some run training together these days, which is fun for Dad. I have to tell her to slow down. She's only got 1 speed, which is fast. But my son, who's 7, he's done a few triathlons. He loves the bike the best.
Yeah.
And our youngest is into it too. She does little running races, and it's in our blood to get outdoors and swim and run and ride bikes, and those sports, the sports that you can do for life, particularly swimming and cycling, I think, because they're non-weight bearing, they're very good to your body, so to speak. You get the cardiovascular fitness, and I love running, but running's a high impact sport on your body, so probably not quite as forgiving as the other 2 disciplines. I'm starting my kids young, and they seem to love it. So yeah, we'll see where it leads.
The beauty of cycling is that it has that huge spectrum of events.
Absolutely, and it was one of the things that drew me to triathlon was the diversity of that sport, bringing 3 great disciplines together. I'm very lucky to live in southern Sydney, where a lot of great cyclists have come from. There's a really strong cycling community down here, and there's absolutely no doubt that helped my triathlon career. I got to do all three of the disciplines with single discipline athletes who were world class, not just national level, but world class, and that helped me improve. I always felt that, obviously being a triathlete, you have to blend the three disciplines, but if I wanted to be a better swimmer, I need to swim with swimmers. If I want to be a better cyclist, and not just better in terms of speed, but better in terms of bike skills, handling, and those sorts of things, I needed to ride with cyclists, and that's what I did, and same with running. So
I mean, looking at you now, you say you compete when you feel like it and you take 6 to 8 weeks to get into form. Do you feel like you ever are going to fall out of form? Because I think retirement's an odd concept for someone who's been as competitive as you.
I think I'll retire from racing for my livelihood, but I don't think I'll ever retire from being active. I was active long before I was a triathlete. I guess as an endurance athlete, I was a late starter. I didn't start until I was 20, 21. I played soccer and other sports growing up. I didn't really have an endurance sports background as such. But I've always been healthy, I think, and active, and that'll continue. As I said, my children are very active. I think my wife and I have tried to instill in them that, part of having a balanced life is not only school but also exercising and all those things. So I think I'll always swim and ride, to be honest. Running's the hard one because it takes a bit of a toll on your body. I guess I'll retire in the sense that I won't be racing for my supper anymore.
A couple of years ago I went to an HTC or a high road training camp, and there was a cardiologist there, and he was talking about the dangers of guys who have been super competitive pulling the pin on their career and needing to taper to make sure that their heart muscle managed the load of everyday ordinary life. Are you conscious of that?
Absolutely. It's something, I studied as a physiotherapist, so I have a bit of a background in physiology, and it's something that I guess is quite close to my own heart because, no pun intended, I know a lot of people who have suffered from the condition that you mentioned, floppy heart. So, you exercise and you have this big, strong heart, and then when you stop, it just gets floppy and it's unable to produce any stroke volume at all. And it's pretty well documented now in endurance athletes who just stop cold turkey and don't train. You have to detrain, I guess, for the demands of normal life, which sounds like a paradox, but it's quite well documented now, and there's been quite a few endurance athletes who have had different cardiac problems. One of my idols in the sport, Craig Walsh, had to retire because of heart problems. So it's something I knew about early on, and something I'm certainly mindful of, especially having a young family. As a 43-year-old, you're mindful of not wanting to damage your body so that you're no good to anybody post-career.
And what about your body now? Do you feel, with Christmas coming on, do you sort of feel like, beauty, I can rip into it, I can have a few beers, I can eat a bit, I can do the things that I never did? Or have you so well versed in looking after your body that you don't succumb to temptation that others often?
I think I was always just well balanced. My mindset and strategy was always a long-term one, sustainability. I was a full-time professional for 20 years, and I think part of that was just being able to manage all those things. When I needed to be very, very regimented with the diet, I would be, but to be honest, all I ever did was eat normal, what I would consider to be normal, and when the training volumes went up, for instance, I was preparing for Kona, then the calorie intake would go up as well, and I would always have a couple of beers with dinner. I remember the second year I was training for Kona, I got very light 6 or 7 weeks before the race. I almost got down to race weight, so I started drinking protein shakes 2 or 3 times a day, and I'd have a beer or two with dinner every night, and I don't think that hurts. So for me, it wasn't about counting the calories as such, it was about prescribing the training and making sure that I hit my KPIs in the training and the benchmarks that I wanted to hit feeling strong. And to do that, you need to fuel yourself the right way. So that's what I tried to do. I listened to my body's feedback, whether I was feeling strong, whether I wasn't quite hitting the marks I needed to hit. But I also enjoyed myself, and ate what I would consider normal. I treated myself every now and again. I think the main thing was I didn't want to sabotage my own training. So I knew what training had to be completed, and I made sure that I was able to do that. But coming into Christmas, I will have a few beers, catching out with people, and I've always done that. I think, if I've got a training day scheduled, I'll just make sure I don't go overboard. So I think it's just about knowing yourself, knowing your strengths and weaknesses. If you're the kind of person who can't go out and have a few and you go overboard, then maybe you need to check yourself. But for me, I was able to do that and still be able to get up and train the next day. So that for me, that was the most important consideration. For a long time, I did the things exactly the same way. In fact, as I would progress through my career, I would add more volume because I was able to withstand and absorb more volume. And I think as your base fitness gets greater and your strength gets greater, which tends to happen as you age as well. I certainly did get to a point, it was probably 39 or 40, and I don't know if it was the age or such, but once again it was the age combined with having young children running around and not getting the recovery that you used to get. There's a difference between having a 5-hour ride and being able to come home and have a protein shake and hop on the couch versus having a 5-hour ride and coming home and then having to take the kids down to the beach, and then the next day you try and ride again and you do have that lactic still in your legs. So I think that plays into it as well. It's not just the age, it's the things that age brings. For me, I think it was about 39 or 40 where I really should have been winding the training back and capitalising on that base work, that base foundation of fitness that you've accumulated over 2 decades. And you hear people talk about that, the muscle memory, and it's not until you actually start cashing in on it, you understand what people are talking about, and you see that you get fitter from less work and things like that. But it's more the mindset. I'd worked hard so long that it was almost hard to switch off and not work as hard. I felt like it was more the mental side of it as much as it was the physical. No doubt there were the physical symptoms there. I would carry the lactic acid longer. I would have to minimize the number of intense sessions I would do per week. So I think it's a matter of fine-tuning that and finding out where your sweet spot is. For me, a lot of the confidence that I got going into big races came from the hard work in training. And when you sort of take a little bit of that out of it, it becomes interesting then, because you have to rely on the thought, well, where does my confidence come from? I don't know too many people who just go in a race thinking, yeah, I'm good, I deserve to be here, I'm going to win. Your confidence has to come from somewhere. I mean, some people are like that. I guess some athletes. For me, it came from the preparation and the hard work and knowing that I'd worked as hard or harder than anybody else, and not only the hard work but the right sort of work to get me in the shape I needed to be in for whatever the demand of the race I was entering. So I think it's an interesting dynamic as you get older. You have to dial back the physical side of things and be content mentally with that as well, and it changes each year as well. I think it comes through a little trial and error, and once you settle on a formula or a new formula that works, it's almost time to dial it down again. What I've noticed is it takes me longer to warm up. The engine still runs well when I get it warmed up, and cardiovascularly, I can still put out the powers that I would put out 10 years ago on the bike. Some of my times in the pool are as good, and often off much less work. I'll do a harder session, not as frequently, and it'll just knock me around for days and days. So I think it's different for everybody, and there's 2 components. There is the physical component, being able to figure out what works for you, because people decline or change differently, and then mentally being okay with that as well, and finding a nice compromise where all those things go together.
It's cool to hear you talk about the quest for motivation, or I guess, to be confident, to be mentally fit for it. Because the triathlon is such a physically demanding thing that everyone just assumes that the successful athlete has the perfect engine and therefore can manage it. Did you do any, mental training, apart from just gaining confidence and what you've just talked about?
It's a good question, because I think it's an important step. I've trained with a lot of athletes who you do a session with them and you think physically this person has got the goods, and then on race day you don't even see them and you think, well, what happened to so and so? And you learn early. I learned early on that the the huge part that the mental component played. There's a lot of physically gifted endurance athletes out there, but it takes much more than that. It takes mental discipline in the race to play the right card at the right time. It takes the confidence. Early in my career, my wife actually suggested that I should go and speak to a sports psychologist. And I did. At that point in my career though, I remember clearly the conversation. She said to me, you get a lot of fourths and fifths and sixths, but you don't win too often. I think it's a mental block. I knew at the time it wasn't a mental block. I was new to the sport, and the guys I was racing were world champions, and looking back in hindsight, some of the best athletes the sport's ever produced. At the time, what was holding me back was physical limitations. I physically wasn't as old, as strong, and I just wasn't as good as they were. But it was good advice that my wife gave me, because I did go and speak to a sports psychologist, and they just gave me different little strategies to work on about focusing on yourself, and it's a lot of the cliches you hear: controlling the things that you can control, preparing the right way to get your confidence, and having different strategies available to you to turn things around when things are not going well in races or in training. How your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions all play into each other. So it's important to act positively. You've got to feel positively, and that starts with thinking positively. So there's that triangle, that sort of feedback loop, and how you can get the ball rolling there. So that it was very useful. I guess I was lucky I had an insight very early as to the very important role that the mind played in governing the body. Not only in terms of, I guess, your ability to make decisions, but motivation and how to push yourself and how to suffer when it was time to suffer. You have to train consistently and do a lot of work, but also the right sort of work at the right time. But the mind game is so important, and you're not going to fulfill your potential until you untap and whatever it is that's holding you back. And we all have something, whether it be self-doubt or whatever it is. But yeah, the mind controls the body, so it makes sense that you need to have your mind game on point to maximize your physical potential.
When you are in that funk, what do you tell yourself? Do you just say, I'll take the day off? It's okay.
No, I never take the day off. What I say is just get out the door and start. When you're in that sort of a rut, the hardest thing to do is to get moving. And as you know from training, a lot of it is that thoughts, feeling, actions thing. You feel tired perhaps from a hard session the day before. You've got those heavy legs. You're thinking of all the other things you've got to do in the day. And I think you can start thinking negatively. Should I do this ride? Should I not do this session? I turn around and go the other way and say, I need to do it. I'm going to get out the door. And then I won't make any decisions about altering the training or changing the training. I mean, I think it's okay to miss sessions if that's what you need to do, if that's what the training calls for, or to alter the training. Maybe you have a harder session plan and it's clear you're not going to be able to accomplish that session and hit the KPIs because of the training leading up to it or other life stresses. Maybe you didn't sleep well the night before because of the kids or whatever. But I never change the training before starting and doing the warm-up. I get into it, do the warm-up, because just through experience I know how often you come through it. And I would have cheated myself out of some of the best sessions I'd ever done if I decided not to do them before I even started. I guess that came with experience, but also, even at the time before I had, I guess, the insight that I have now, I thought, part of my job is to feel tired. I'm an endurance athlete. This is part of my job description. And every job has parts of it that you don't like.
Yeah.
I'm not going to roll over and play dead just because I'm not feeling well today, or maybe I need to change the day around, but I'm going to get the day started. And that was always the goal when I was in one of those rusts, just get out the door and get the day started and then make smart decisions after that. I think it's too easy to get into habits of, I'm going to have the day off, and it can snowball. And it comes down to a self-awareness as well. Each one of us, I think we know mentally our strengths and weaknesses. And one of my strengths is I operate well within a routine. So I just got to keep going in the routine, just keep getting out the door. If things weren't going your way, or you obviously weren't going to hit the numbers you needed to hit, or that effort indicator you needed to hit, maybe just go out and do an easy recovery flush ride instead of that 8 by 3 minutes, over threshold. When you're tired, you can be emotional, but just get out the door and get the day started and make smart decisions after that.
if I consider triathletes, they've always been talked about as being numbers crazy.
Oh yeah.
They love to.
Yeah.
They love everything.
I love the gadgets and all the tech.
What numbers did you respond to the most? Did you find that power was important, heart rate? What are you motivated by?
I think it's all good, but it has its place as well. I mean, when I started in the mid-90s, there were heart rate monitors, and at the time I was a uni student with a part-time job. I couldn't afford a heart rate monitor. So I learned the first effort indicator I used was RPE, or rate of perceived exertion.
Right.
And I learned what it felt like to do 3 minutes at max. I didn't need a watch to tell me I was at max. It was to failure basically. But then if someone said, well, I don't want you to go 3 minutes to max, I want you to do 8 lots of 3 minutes, but they have to be hard and at your aerobic threshold, so to speak, or at your threshold. I learned what that meant, my best sustainable pace for the entirety of that 3 minutes, knowing that I had to repeat that effort 8 times. And if I got it right, then I'd probably fade a little bit towards efforts number 7 and 8, but not just drop off. So my effort indicator early in my career was always subjective. But I'm glad I learnt that way, because I learnt my body very well. And even though it was a subjective effort indicator, it translated well across going up to altitude or going into hot or cold climates where your numbers can change. And it's all well and good to have these wearable tech devices and seeing this number, but unless you know how to change that number dependent upon what climate you're in or where you're at, it's irrelevant. I think it was the second year I was racing in Kona, 2008. Actually it was 2007, the first year I raced Ironman distance. I got a power meter put on my bike, and it was a great idea. I'd never trained to power until that point, but I think it gave the sessions more purpose. It made each second accountable, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
You know which zones you're meant to be in. And it certainly gave each session more specific purpose and accountability. And, if you think about an Ironman triathlon, the cycling portion is 180 kilometres. So depending on the course, roughly 4.5 hours, which is more than half the race. So my mindset going, into that sort of racing, Ironman racing, was the cycling is the largest portion of this event here. That's where you need to focus. I felt most of my training time, and the power meter helped me do that. It helped me train, and especially when you're up the mileage, which invariably you need to do for a 180 kilometer individual time trial, I think it helps to have that number or that effort indicator telling you when it's meant to be a long easy ride that you're in that correct space, or if you're meant to be high aerobic, 10, 15, 20, 30 minute sort of efforts at the end of a long ride, time trial efforts, you need to be in that high aerobic, close to threshold zone. If you're doing a session, which you tend not to do too much of, but still important in the long distance training, maybe 5 by 5 minutes at or over threshold, that power number helps you know that you're in the right zone there, or whether you're fatigued or not. Can you hit that zone from all, when you're in that cloud of fatigue and doing all that mileage? So I think it gave my training more direction and more specificity for sure. That being said, in the race I still relied heavily on my perceived exertion, even though I had the power meter on there. And when I trained more and more at altitude, which I did throughout my career, I got a heart rate monitor just to see what my heart was doing up at the higher and higher altitudes. But once again, I still leaned heavily on perceived exertion. So I guess I came into the sport in the mid-90s at a time where it was still an old school mentality. And that doesn't mean I'm against what I see now. I mean, invariably we live in a world where technology's everywhere, and it only makes sense it's going to infiltrate sports and endurance sports. And I'm all for that, so long as we know what it is we're looking at and what we're measuring, and ultimately how we use that number to get faster, because that's what we're talking about. It's been interesting for me now that I'm sort of transitioning from athlete into helping run this coaching business. So I'm seeing things from two perspectives now, the coach and the athlete. And I'm certainly not against the wearable tech at all. I think it's very, very useful. But once again, only as good as the person interpreting the data and making the recommendations moving forward as how we can implement that into our training program moving forward to reach the ultimate goal, which is to get quicker for all of us, whatever our level, or to get more efficient, however you want to say it.
Yeah.
So I'm certainly not against any of that stuff, but it certainly can help you make training more adaptable and more customized to the individual. But again, it's only as useful as the person interpreting the data and making the suggestions. 10 years ago when bikes were getting more aero and everybody was into wind tunnel testing, I think there was a period there where we went away from actually fitting athletes to their bike the right way. Everyone was so keen to get aerodynamic and see that drag number come down that we sort of neglected comfort and at the detriment of power dropping off towards the end. Sure. When you got sore backs or particularly in our sport, not being able to run well off the bike because you'd put those posterior muscles in a lengthened, weakened position for 40, 90 or 180 kilometers and then you weren't able to run effectively. So I think all these technologies, it's like anything, it takes a while for the body of knowledge and the way we use it to catch up with the actual technology itself so that we can get the maximum value out of it.
When we're talking about position, I'll ask you the obvious one that comes from my 11-year-old. You've got the option to ride any position you want, from my understanding. There aren't in positions like we have in cycling. So the UCI can't dictate how you're allowed to sit on the bike, what bike you're allowed to use. Why don't you use the Superman position?
That's a good question. Well, I've never ridden or trained on it. From what I understand, obviously through the hour records on the track and what it's more aerodynamic, but I think it would be a very hard position to hold for 4.5 hours. And particularly in a race like Kona where it's very windy and the winds are predominantly crosswinds, you need a position and first of all you need a strong core. But you also need a position where your core can be engaged and your upper body can be relaxed and you're generating power obviously from here down and being able to hold that position whilst getting blown all over the road. I think the Superman position is extremely aerodynamic. And on the velodrome, it looks, I mean, I guess it's horses for courses. On the velodrome, it's probably perfect. There's no wind, and you're all about minimizing that drag as much as possible, and there's no run afterwards. I would hate to, it doesn't look like a super comfortable position, even though it is the Superman position. It doesn't look super comfortable, but ultimately, I think what you see is, it's not a one-size-fits-all sort of deal, but depending on an athlete's morphology, some people have longer legs to torso, vice versa, etc., etc. People tend to come up with a position that these days that is aerodynamic and they reduce the number as much as possible, but not at the expense of being uncomfortable. And I think in triathlon, I know certainly the first time I got in the wind tunnel, it was enlightening to me, and a lot of the gains I got were by swapping helmets, so different helmets, and also drink bottle setup and tidying up the setup. I used to go to Kona with 4 drink bottles on the bike, and I mean in my early years there I didn't know how great the aid stations were and how close they were together, and you'd heard horror stories of people dehydrating and melting out in the lava field, so I carried 4 bottles. And I think the first year I raced I was the only athlete who started the bike segment with 4 drink bottles. When I first went in the wind tunnel, a lot of the gains we were able to get in minimizing my own personal drag was just drink bottle placement, where to put them, the shape of those bottles, tidying up the front end set up with cabling and all that. There's a lot of little things you can do with the aerodynamics of what here to what's there.
And people talk about the gains, companies. They talk about the benefits of saving that wattage. Do you feel it? Do you notice it in your times, in your...
Yeah, you do. And I think it's not so much about going quicker, it's about being efficient and not slowing down. And I think one of the things that I learned in the wind tunnel is one of the most aerodynamic things you can do is not move, have what they call a quiet position. So you're just there not moving. And you look at the great time trials, particularly in cycling, they don't move. Their upper body, they're generating all the power from here, they don't move. And that's very aerodynamic. So I think if we go 1 or 2 steps backwards, to have a position that's enables you to not move means it must be quite comfortable. So you need to find that, and it depends too, I mean, as you get older, there's limitations with flexibility and strength. So these are all things that change as you age as well. But I think a good bike fit person will first of all, look at your current position, see if you're having any particular issues. Also, perform a physical examination to see where you're strong, where you're weak, where you're flexible, where you're not. So to work out what your individual constraints are and any particular issues you may have, then sort of translate the theory of what, obviously that everyone wants to get forward and down, but it's got to be within the constraints of what your body will allow you to do, whilst maintaining that comfort and being able to sustain that power. So there's a lot of considerations, but ultimately I think when you're doing an event that takes 8+ hours and you have to run a marathon off a 180 kilometre individual time trial, you need to be comfortable. Certainly off the back of that, once you dial in a comfortable, powerful position, then you look at tightening the other things up and getting a great helmet that's ventilated, maybe drink bottle placement, great wheel and tyre choice. There's certainly things, you don't want to make it any harder than it has to be, and if you can get 1 watt here, 2 watts there, if there's 5 or 6 different areas where you could get 2 or 3 watts, and that adds up to 15 watts, well, anyone would take that.
Just to conclude, there'll come a time where you don't have to go faster anymore and you can just get out there and ride. Or run or swim. What's going to be fun for Crowie when you stop doing it for time gains and wattage savings?
I think fun for me will always be mountain biking, particularly when I can do it with the kids. Swimming, I think I'll always swim. Maybe only once a week in the pool, but in the open water. We live so close to the beaches, and I've always sort of incorporated open water swimming into my training. But it's actually enjoyable and it's mentally not as taxing as going up and down a black line. But I love to surf. I haven't surfed a lot since having kids and being a professional athlete. I haven't mountain biked a lot. I was always mindful of not wanting to crash and break something in the pre-season or the off-season that would limit, my next 12 months. So I think not having those things hanging over your head. I'll do more mountain biking with the kids. I'll certainly get out and hit the water more. I like to paddle or ski. I've done a lot of that, stand-up paddle boarding. I grew up just being outside and being healthy and active, so I can't see anything changing. I won't be chasing time gains and trying to minimise grams, pounds per square inch of drag and all that kind of stuff. But I'll always get out and enjoy the outdoors, and I like to be fit. I like the feeling you get after a morning workout or a morning session, whether it be in the ocean or out in the national park or wherever it may be. I think it's a great way to start the day, and so I think we'll always be an active family. I'll get out with the kids and get out and hit the waves a lot more, like I used to when I was younger.
It's a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you
very much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good. Cheers, man.